Morning. I am absolutely delighted to introduce our guest speaker, Kaysen and Dilly Kuhns' father. John D. Kuhns is a businessman and author, most importantly, Casey and Dylan's father. He is the chairman and CEO of Kuhns Brothers, an investment banking firm boutique, and of the China Hand Fund, a private equity organization with investments in Chinese companies. Mr. Kuhns has closed 5 IPOs, initial public offerings, of companies he has created. Most recently, in 2006, Mr. Kuhns founded China Hydroelectric Corporation, the largest foreign owner and operator of hydroelectric projects in China, which closed its IPO on the New York Stock Exchange in January of 2010. Mr. Kuhns received his undergraduate degree from Georgetown University, where he was captain of the varsity football team and is a member of the university's Athletic Hall of Fame. A Master of Fine Arts from the University of Chicago, where he is also a teaching assistant in sculpture and drawing, and he has an MBA from the Harvard Business School. Author of China Fortunes, a novel published in January by John Wiley & Sons, Mr. Kuhns hopes to publish his second book in 2012. Let us warmly welcome Mr. John Kuhns.
Thank you, Bob, and it's a pleasure to be here. That all probably sounds pretty boring to some of you folks, I would imagine. When I was your age, I can assure you I wasn't thinking about my career or business. I think things are a little different today. But I'm going to date myself. I graduated from high school in 1968. We had the Vietnam War going on. And more importantly, I had other things on my mind. So I'm supposed to just signal that I want the next slide. Okay, so basically you heard some of my business credentials, and I am very proud of them. But many of you are probably thinking these days, how do you get from here to there? And so this is, my story, and it is essentially the basic thread of my novel, China Fortunes, which I'll speak about a little later. But before I did some of the things Bob mentioned, there was a starting point, and maybe I can get the next slide. Just like Casey and Dylan, my high school ambitions were largely centered around football, and I also was not deviated from that theme in college. I was originally given a scholarship to attend the University of Virginia out of high school, ended up transferring to Georgetown. I tried out for the Redskins and the Dallas Cowboys. George Allen, who was the coach of the Redskins at the time I tried out, said, "Kuhns, you're a couple inches too short, 2 steps too slow, and probably too smart to be out here. Get out of here." Okay, so that was it for my football career, and I had to think of something else, which was a shocking development for me at age 22 because I'd never thought of anything else until then. I was a fine arts major at Georgetown. A lot of you might think it's a gut course, but I was always interested in fine arts. And my father sent my portfolio to the University of Chicago, so having nothing else on the horizon, I took a scholarship to study for my Master of Fine Arts at the University of Chicago, and I was also a teaching assistant in sculpture and drawing. And one of the reasons to point to this part of my career is, again, I'm sure many of your parents are focusing you as much as they can on your career ambitions and so forth. Don't let it get too dry. The best thing is to do what you want to do, because what you want to do you're going to be good at, and things that you don't want to do you're going to be less skillful at. And I was a good artist, but I wasn't the next Picasso. And when you're sitting there like I was in my sculpture studio about 14 hours a day with this jackhammer, because I'm a stone carver, no audio devices in the microphones yet, so you have a lot of time to think. And I started thinking about what the heck was I going to do, because I was pretty sure that I wasn't going to be good at this. And it wasn't the money. I mean, don't ever do any career choice or execute any career choice for the money. That's very legitimate advice. Do things that you want to do. So I, like many of you, picked up the phone one day and I called my mother and I said, you know, Mom, I don't think I'm going to be a great artist. What else could I possibly do? And she said, have you ever thought about going to business school? And I hadn't, but I did. And next slide, please. I got into this place, Harvard Business School, which is a fantastic place for any of you who find your way there. And I got in, as I like to say, as a token poet. In other words, they need to round out the class a little bit, get some art majors in there to counterbalance all the accounting and business geniuses. But I can tell you, when I got there, I was scared to death. I almost didn't make it. But that's another thing about New Horizons. It's okay to be a slow learner as long as you ultimately get there. And one day, I realized I was going to graduate like everybody else. And when I first got to Harvard, people would say, well, wait a minute. I mean, what did you study as an undergrad? And I said, well, sculpture and drawing. And they said, what are you doing here? And I had to justify myself, at least in my own eyes, for a while by saying, well, I want to manage a museum, okay, or maybe an art gallery, go to work for Sotheby's or something like that. But pretty soon I realized, well, wait a minute, I don't have to do that. I'm going to get the same diploma as everybody else. So once again, I, like you, started thinking about, at this point in my life, what I wanted to do. And I decided that I would, next slide, go to Wall Street. Now, I had probably no business going to Wall Street. I wasn't mathematically inclined. I am still not mathematically inclined. But remember that creativity thread? Some people said that Wall Street needed creative types. Now, some other people said, who are you kidding? Wall Street is evolutionary, not revolutionary. That's a guy who turned me down for a job at First Boss, and I've never forgotten that. But basically, they do need creative types in places like Wall Street, boring places indeed like Wall Street. And I got there, but I also knew myself pretty well. And I was no genius, and I figured I was going to keep it simple. And I would also recommend that any of you who are thinking about a Wall Street career, or where this is going, an entrepreneurial career, you don't have to be a genius. You don't have to have some high-tech ideas or skills to be on Wall Street or start a company. It's actually better if you keep it simple. So I looked around on Wall Street, and basically, what did I find? I found that, believe it or not, in any country in the world, the most money is invested in electricity. Now, in other words, what I'm saying is power plants, transmission line, distribution lines. Sounds pretty boring, right? I'll get back to that in a minute. But what I said, well, is that if there's a lot of money invested in the United States in the electric power industry, they're going to need people, even dummies like me. So I went into that area and focused on electric power, and I went into the project finance department of a big firm called Solomon Brothers, which none of you probably have ever heard of, but when I was there, it was the finest firm on Wall Street. Wall Street, however, is typically a kind of a launching pad for people like me who are going there, getting skills, and going on to different careers, and I was no exception. Next slide. What I was working on was things like this: project financing for hydroelectric power companies. And in 1981, Congress changed the law to allow for the first time people other than utilities to own power plants. Before that, you can only own a power plant if you were a utility, which is a pretty boring thing to be, and nobody wanted to be that. But if you could just own something like this yourself, think about it. Rain comes down the mountain, goes down this sluiceway, generates power. There's not a lot of employees, very few headaches. What could be better, right? And this happens to be in China. And the reason this is important is because China was just then opening up, And they were making really inexpensive hydroelectric equipment, not only for themselves, but for the first time for export to other countries. So I got an idea. Remember that creativity stuff? It came in handy for me. Next slide, please. I wanted to do an IPO myself with a little business plan, sitting in a telephone booth, a couple of nickels to rub together. And what I learned, and what you guys will learn, any of you who are interested in this type of thing, an IPO depends on, as we say, the moon and stars lining up. But there are going to be cycles of capital formation on the street. And those cycles, when they come together, as long as you have a good idea, take advantage of it, get out, and maybe you, like me, can put together an IPO. So I left Salomon Brothers in 1981 when they changed this law. I formed friendships in China. I started buying cheap equipment in China and installing it in sites in the United States. And because my equipment was so cheap, I was making a lot of money. Next slide, please. So I took my first company public when I was 34. I started the company when I was 31. It was called Catalyst Energy Corporation. It was something called an independent power producer. What's an independent power producer? Remember I told you the utilities used to be the only people who could own power plants, and then they created this new law in Congress. And I went out and I was one of the people trying to take advantage of this legal change, and people on the street that I asked for money said, well, what are you? Are you a builder? No. Are you a utility? Absolutely not. You make equipment? No. Well, what are you? And I said, I had to tell these people what I was. So I said, I'm a independent power producer. So today, most of the power plants in this country, you may not know this, are owned by IPPs, independent power producer, and I'm the guy who came up with this term back in 1981, and Catalyst Energy was the first independent power producer in the United States. We listed on the New York Stock Exchange, and according to Inc. magazine, don't take my word for it, we were the fastest growing company in the United States from 1982 to 1987, and we went from that little telephone booth I was telling you about to about $1 billion in assets. And it was a huge home run for me, and most of our success was due to the fact that I was buying this cheap Chinese hydro equipment and using it in sites in the United States. So for example, I'm the only person who's ever built a hydro plant on the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River is not one that drops precipitously like that, which is good for hydro. It drops slowly. So that's an inefficient type of site. But if you have cheap Chinese equipment, it doesn't matter. Okay, so that was a really attractive situation for us. I sold this company for $1 billion in 1988 to a Canadian conglomerate. Now, next slide, please. A lot of people said, John, how come you're not richer, right? Well, here's another lesson for all of you. I mean all of you, okay? Try not to borrow a lot of money. It can come back to haunt you, okay? So there's something called a margin loan, right? You may know, some of you may know what it is. When you get a bunch of stock worth about $30 million, Merrill Lynch or Morgan Stanley will lend you money against that stock, okay? And the first thing you think, like I did, again, I was only about 36, 37 years old, is, God, this is manna from heaven, because they're lending me money against just these pieces of paper, right? Well, it's all good when the market is going up, but when the market goes down and all you have is that piece of paper, you're in big trouble. And so when the market collapsed, that's the biggest collapse in the history of Wall Street, October 19th, 1987. On Sunday night, I was worth about $50 million. On Tuesday morning, when the dust cleared, I owed the banks $10 million, okay? That's not something you want to do, and the best way to avoid it is don't borrow a lot of money. However, I was only 37 when this happened, still very young. And one thing when you're very young is you tend to ignore history. Now, what's history got to do with this? It's very rare that somebody can do one IPO, have a big success, for whatever reason, come back and try and do another. It's very rare that they'll be able to pull that off. But undaunted, I decided to try again. Next slide, please. Okay, so how is it that you can do an IPO? What do you really need? Well, the most important are these men and women here on the left. And you'll hear this, it sounds like a truism, it even sounds boring, but no company can get anywhere unless the people are really good. So look around you now, and next time you're going to start a business, think about who in this room, and there's probably a lot of them, that you could count on to form a team. The chemistry's got to be right. But when you get that group of people, all you need is these next three things, okay? Earnings is profits, right? Luck, we all know what that is. I'd rather be lucky than good. Anybody who doesn't understand that, get out the dictionary. It's really important to be lucky on Wall Street. But you also need a unique selling proposition. What's that? Just something that you can tell the investors, because they hear 50 of these pitches a week, and the investor walks away and he says, I'm going to try this because of that unique selling proposition. Now, what was mine for my second company? Next slide, please. Renewable power. Sound familiar? Well, it's a big, hot number today, right? But if you look at my back, you'll see all these arrows sticking out. That's what happens when the Indians are too far out ahead, okay? What happened to me was I decided to start the first renewable power company worldwide in 1992, way too early, right? Way too early. And so it was a good idea, but it was sexy at the time, but it would have problems later. But next slide. I took my second company public in 1993. It was called New World Power, and it was 10 years later. My God, it seemed like forever. Okay, it was only 10 years since I founded Catalyst. I was 41. It was the first renewable power-based company operational in the world. We were the first wind farm company, for example, to go public. We were the only profitable solar company in the Western Hemisphere, and my friends in China asked me to come back because they were deregulating, and we built 5 hydroelectric stations in China, and I was the first American to build hydro plants in China. More about that later, okay? I sold the company to another Canadian group in 1997. Thank God for those Canadians, right? Okay. Once I sold the company, irrepressible, I wanted to start a third one. What else, right? If you're doing something and it seems to work out, why change, right? These are some interesting facts. This one here is the most important. For those of you who read the paper, you probably read about all the solar power in China, all the exciting wind power. That's those little slivers up here that you can barely identify the number for. This royal blue piece of pizza, though, 22% basically, that's hydro. And that's a huge amount of hydro. As a matter of fact, China is the hydro capital of the world. Now, these two graphs are also very interesting. You'll notice you can't read these numbers, so I'll just tell you, this is the electric generation capacity of China, 3,433, actually that's 3,433,000 megawatts, right? So this is how much you can generate. Over here is the electric consumption, 427 megawatts, sorry. Anybody think there's any problem with this? Okay, they're equal, right? In other words, as much capacity as they can build, they're going to suck up all the juice, right? Is that a stable situation? It means the power is going off every day, right? That's not a good situation. So I said China looks like an ideal opportunity. Next slide, please. So I went to Beijing, okay? And I said goodbye to Casey and Dylan. And actually, I've been going to Beijing every month since 2005. And it's exhausting, but that's where the money is. More about that later. Next slide, please. Okay, now this is really what motivated me to put together my power company in China. Now, for those of you studying Mandarin, everybody know what this symbol is? Water, right? Okay. So there's a little story about this. This is the logo for China Hydroelectric Corporation. And when you're going to get together with the people with the money and try and raise some dough, first of all, you get some lawyers to help you put together something called a prospectus or a private placement memorandum. And it's a big, thick, boring document that has a few informative pages in it about your numbers and your projection. But basically, the rubber meets the road when you sit down with these people around a long table, 18 people around the room, and you start working on this deal and checking out all the numbers. And so my lawyer called me one night. We were just about to have that meeting the next morning, and he said, "John, you got to have a logo." And I said, "What do I need a logo for?" He says, "Look, just, make the prospectus look good, pick a logo, and we can change it later if we want." So I called up a friend of mine, Chu Yi, who was a graphic artist. I said, "Chu Yi, can you just do a logo for me? I mean, anything." She said, "Well, just tell me something." I said, "Well, why don't you pick the symbol for water and then surround it with a red circle for red China," right? And so she did that, and she sent it back over to me on my computer, and I put it on the document and didn't think any more of it. The next morning, 9 o'clock in the morning, we got the 18 people around the table. My lawyer comes over to me and goes, "John, this is, I don't know how to say this. It's kind of difficult." I said, "Well, what?" He said, "Well, you can't use your initials as the company logo." Everybody get that? Okay? Right? Okay. Fake, right? So I said, "I think I'm going to make a fortune here." Next slide. Okay, so what I did was in 2006, I raised a bunch of money, and we've invested about just under $1 billion in China. And I started building and buying these things. Now, what are these things called? They're called small hydroelectric projects. They're actually not small, okay? One of these things would supply all the power for Watertown, Waterbury, surrounding environs, right? They're about 40, 50 megawatts, and a megawatt in the United States will supply about 1,000 homes. In China, how many think you were talking about? Probably 12,000, right? I mean, they don't even like to turn on light bulbs in the country because they're too expensive, right? So we put all this together, and next slide, please. They're located in these places, okay? Zhejiang is the richest province in China. Fujian, these are right on the coast. They get typhoons coming off the South China Sea. Sichuan, good food, hot food. And Yunnan, if you ever get a chance, treat yourself and go to Yunnan. It's the California of China. It's the National Geographic part of China where everybody is in the rice paddies. I mean, something like 50 different ethnic minorities there, really fantastic people, fantastic food, and a big hydro location. Next slide, please. So, this is actually my 5th IPO. I didn't tell you about 2 others, okay? But all 3 of these involved hydro, and we went public on the New York Stock Exchange on January, 28th or something like that, and we raised $100 million. And one of the points of this little discussion is that I don't think I could have gotten there any other way than the way I did, which was serendipitous, right? So when people start pressuring you for like predictable career paths, etc., just follow your own nose. Remember a couple of things I've said. You got to be good at something, because if you enjoy it, you'll work at it 22 hours a day. If you don't like it, you're going to want to take long lunch breaks. Next slide. Okay, so next Ernest Hemingway, I don't think so. But what I wanted to do always was do something creative like I had been doing when I was a sculptor. You can't take around a sack of sculpture tools, but you can take around your computer and write. So I started writing about 3 years ago. Next slide, please. And I wrote this book. It's a novel. A lot of people say, well, John, it's a novel? So who wrote it? I said, I wrote it. I said, how could you write it? You're a businessman, okay? Just to tell you, if you have interesting experiences, whatever you're doing, what do they say? That everybody's got at least one novel in them, or everybody can write a novel? Well, here's my first. I hope it's not my last. It's about, guess what, a businessman doing business in the U.S. and China in the hydroelectric area. For any of you interested in China, even if you never go there, I'm not trying to sell this, it's cheap, you can get it on Amazon, but you really ought to read this book. I mean, seriously, for any of you, Casey and Dylan went with a class trip over there. I think a lot of people are interested in China. It's where the money is. But if you don't get to go, or you think you might go, but you want to check it out, put your toe in the water first, this is a good way to learn about China. Next slide, please. So here's my next career. Okay, thank you very much.